So somebody has to.
Good afternoon. We're here on our second panel of the day. Great pleasure of mine to introduce Dr. Charles Henry, who's chair of the African American Studies Department and who teaches an amazing course on the political philosophy of Martin Luther King and has generously agreed to co-sponsor our conference and is going to chair this panel here and be the host for a discussion on the subject of social justice in the age of big data. And I ask you to please welcome Charles Henry.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. Greg didn't mention the Martin Luther King course is online, and this will be the fourth summer I've done it online. And as some of you know, UC Berkeley is contemplating putting a number of regular semester courses online, but they started experimenting with summer session courses about 4 years ago. And so it seems to be going well. If I get a chance, I'll jump in with a couple of comments, but we have a very distinguished panel, and what I'm going to do is introduce them and then throw out a question and give people a chance to respond to that question. They may or may not decide that they want to take on that question. And when we kind of exhaust that, we'll move to a second and third question. Greg, have we allotted some time for questions or interaction from the audience?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There's a comment in the audience. Just ask for the microphone.
Okay, terrific.
Heather is going to be able to provide you with the microphone. So thank you. Let's give a quick handout to Heather Browning for making
She's getting lots of exercise. So let me go around and introduce the panel first. Starting with my immediate left, we have Victoria Robinson, the director of the American Culture Center here at UC Berkeley. Our next panelist is Omaja Miller, who's a UC Berkeley engineering student, right?
I'm in computer science and education, actually.
I've been given faulty information, which is not unusual for me. Thank you for that correction. No. And next to her is Jabari Mahiri, a professor in UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Education. And next to Professor Mahiri is Chris Fallon, who is here at UC Berkeley in film. And next to Chris is Davy D., who is a professor at San Francisco State University. And also, you may also hear him on KPFA. On Hard Knock, and is also a UC Berkeley alum. And our final panel member is I've got so many. I'm retiring. My site is going. Ayman Sharma from Yahoo. Thank you for being here. Thank all of you for being here. The question we wanted to start the discussion with is what structural aspects of mainstream and alternative tools are supporting or discouraging inclusion? Let me repeat that. What structural aspects of mainstream and alternative tools are supporting or discouraging inclusion? Who wants to start us off with that? Yes.
All right, so I'm going to start us off with that. A little bit about my background. I grew up in Nigeria and then came to the United States. So for me, being in computer science was just a lifeline. It was the reason why I was able to remain in both cultures. And something very interesting has happened in the last couple of years. With the advent of the widespread use of internet, and even in places like Nigeria, places like Lagos, I realized that a big part of who we are is coming to the fore, and we're now the ones telling our own stories, instead of having our stories being choreographed by other people. And so we're beginning to own our own companies online, own our own institutions online, and something even bigger is happening. So if you grew up in Nigeria, you were really not taught Nigerian history. You're educated to participate in a global space. So for a long time, you will not know about who you are or what your people have done. And so institutions like, it's hard for me to say this, but I have to say it, Facebook and YouTube, Google, these companies who have set up this infrastructure I've allowed regular people to come together and decide to use it for a totally different purpose. So there's this thing on Facebook called the Nigerian Nostalgia Project, and it's a web page where people just submit images, and what it has ended up being is a form of history. So people put up pictures, oh, here's my grandfather from 1927, and they write all this history about what the person did. And it's now crowdsourced and crowd-curated. So people battle back and forth whether it was accurate, it was inaccurate. So over time, you actually get accurate histories of people. Without having those connections or those institutions, all that information would have just been gone, it would have just gone away. And other companies, institutions like Al Jazeera, who is not from the United States, who is outside of the United States, are giving us a better way to actually curate our own stories because they throw it open to you. You can go write a blog. You can do this. You can do that. So these kinds of institutions allow for us to tell our own stories. However, if you are not sophisticated enough to have access to them, then it locks you out. So there are two sides to the coin. Once you gain access, you pretty much can do whatever you want. So I guess the next thing is we have to ensure that most people get access to those kinds of tools.
I'll pick up from there in terms of the question, structural aspects that are discouraging or supporting inclusion. I really think that one of the most important structural aspects in our society that's discouraging in inclusion is schooling. And a lot of our discussions are about the ways that people engage in, online activities and digital mediation of learning and experiences for pleasure, for power, for self-identification, et cetera. But they're always, almost often, happening outside of schools. And one of the things that I've been interested in, I just published a book called Digital Tools in Urban Schools, is our young people are spending 6 to 7 hours a day inside of schools. And when I go in schools, and I have an opportunity to go into schools all the time because I work with teacher professional development as one of the things that I do, in addition to guiding the work of a number of doctoral students. And the level of digital mediation of learning inside of school places, with the exception of a few oasis schools that are high resource and things like that, but if we go to almost any of our normal public schools, there's not much of digital learning going on in those situations. So to allow other panelists to have an opportunity to talk, I think that there's, I'll close with, I think that there's a new digital divide, and it's the divide between everyday life versus life in schools. And that when you go into a school place, you're spending 6 hours pretty much marginalized and not included in any kinds of learning that's mediated by high levels of digital technology. I have a lot of ideas, about why that is. In Digital Tools in Urban Schools, when we were working actually in an alternative school, in a continuation high school, we tried to train the teachers to utilize, to develop more confidence and competence in mediating instruction with a variety of digital tools. Our past speaker, and I appreciated her presentation as well as the entire conference, talked about access and motivation and skills and confidence as the sort of three arenas that we have to look at. And actually, 90% of schools in the United States have online access. But the motivation of the teachers on the one hand, which I think is a key thing, and the actual skills and confidence that they have in transforming their conception of how you address instruction is really not there. And that's where I think a lot of our digital activism needs to be placed.
Okay.
I'll pick up from where he left off. In order to answer your question, I kind of divide people into three different groups. There's a group of people that don't know and don't have. They're completely shut out, and that needs to be corrected if we're talking about social justice. The second group is those who do have, like I have a laptop, but do I have the full understanding of its potential and what does it do? And do I have access to people that can immerse me in a climate where we're constantly building and learning from one another, because he may play one way and I'll play it another way, and we come up with something together. So that's a challenge. And then the third are those who are very creative or entrepreneurial, they want to be the next quote-unquote Steve Jobs or whatever, what access do they have? And are they able to be supported and have the money and resources to go down the road that those who I mentioned have gone through? From where I sit, the thing that I look at, since we're talking about social justice, is that these tools are tools of communication at the end of the day. The sister was just talking about being able to tell your own stories. And for a very long time, sizable numbers of our people and others have not been able to tell their stories without a media middleman. So now we're able to do that. And that's been celebrated. But at the same time, we've been pushed in a direction where it's going to wind up, if we're not careful, being at the very starting point that we began at, where only a few are able to tell their stories. And what I mean by that are two things. One, you have this culture of consumerism that moves us in the direction of use the YouTube videos, use these platforms, but they don't necessarily invite you to add to these platforms in a way that reflects where you're coming from and the best practices that are unique to you and your community. So that's a problem. The second thing, which we often don't talk about, is this fight around intellectual property. So I'll give you an example. Today I put up a video, and the natural way in which we would tell our stories is like I might snipe something from you, pick a little bit of what you said, and then I add my own flavor and we come up with something new. But nowadays you're increasingly finding that if I do that in telling my digital story, somebody goes, well, I own that copyright, or I own this copyright. And it's not just a little thing. I mean, I was just talking with the members of Public Enemy, and they had problems putting their own video up on YouTube because some big company says, well, we own that song in the background, we own that image, and these types of things become very daunting after a while. It might not hit everybody, but once you start talking to the masses, all of a sudden you start running into these problems, and that's where you start to find a big divide. The last thing, and this is where I see a divide happening, or if there is a divide where it takes place, is time is a luxury. If you're an artist or if you are creative, it's good to have the information on how to use the tools, but you really don't do your best learning until you have time to play around with it. Using my loading up a video today, it took me maybe 5 or 6 hours. I had the luxury of getting up at 6 in the morning and working on that video to maybe noon. And in the course of doing that, I'm playing around with filters and I'm flipping things around and I'm trying to find out what's the best way to upload it to get the sharpness, the crispiness and all this other stuff. And a lot of people just don't have that, you know, especially the average person who's working 9 to 5, who comes home, wants to tell their story, and God forbid if there's a crash on their computer, all that sort of stuff. These are little things we don't think about, but it can become very daunting to somebody who like only have an hour to do this, and 45 minutes of that hour was spent on something that is a technical glitch. So I think those barriers that I just named exist, and we need to find ways to remove them so that more people can be inclusive. I don't think right now the language of technology as we see these current crop of structures that exist, I don't think they fully accommodate the different ways in which we all see the world and would like to participate. It's either you fit into this paradigm or you don't. And many people are trying to do that, and many have been successful, but there's a whole lot of others where it just rubs them the wrong way. And if we don't take that into account, I think we'll be back to answering this question 10 years later.
Good point.
So I want to talk to two things, which is both the reference pointed to the university. So using the university to talk about structures and social justice, which is one is that inside the university right now there's pressures for all systems to talk to each other. And as an instructor in ethnic studies and then somebody who coordinates directs the American Culture Center, there's a concern in technology becoming synergistic, that everything speaks to each other, which is that there are some students who use gaps in the system to actually negotiate through those shadow systems. So for example, if I have an AB 540 student or a student who can't pay their enrollment or tuition this year,
I can enroll them in the class and then backfill their grades, through systems. So in terms of social justice, what does it mean to remove the gaps in technology systems when those very gaps have been the spaces for social justice to happen for some of our student populations? So that's just one kind of reference point. And the second is that what we're doing right now in the American Cultures program is that this is a requirement for the campus. Every student who's an undergraduate has to graduate with meeting the American Cultures requirement. And we have like 7,000 courses that meet the AC requirement every semester. A portion of those courses now are working with community. So there are community partners who are integrated into the research projects of these courses. So these aren't direct service sites. The idea is that the interests and questions of the partners are integrated into the questions asked for research in the classroom. So it kind of changes the relationship of the partner as deficit to asset as co-educator and co-learner and co-researcher. So those dynamics are really interesting. And what's enabling that work to really become reciprocal is the bridge of technology, right? So the question really always is for this university, who sits in our classrooms and are they fee paying, right? So what does it mean to actually engage with a community partner and have them maybe virtually sit in the classroom with us and engage in the same curriculum? When we have fees that are sky high that pay for our libraries and our journals, those community partners, through the work of sitting in the classroom virtually, or actually being the recipient of research projects that our students construct with them, can actually gain access to these kind of sites of privilege. That's really interesting. In my current class right now, which is on prison abolition, our community partner is critical resistance. Every student in that class is building a Wikipedia site, a Wikipedia page, that is relevant for the 2012 elections, that's built around questions of abolition, the war on drugs, juvenile justice, broken windows theory, AB 900. And so every student in that class is really having to become kind of themselves relating to the Wikipedia technology to enable what John Hope Franklin called bridge work. How do you engage from the university as a site of privilege to a community that you want to work with? And it's what's been fascinating about that process is that the students themselves are very illiterate in terms of developing Wikipedia. They've been consuming it. Right? They've absolutely not been there and actually doing anything with that work. So if you look at the site for pregnancy, 97% of all submissions on the site for pregnancy should be interest to many people. 97% of those submissions come from the global north, white men with a degree and over the age of 33. So, when faced with that kind of data illiteracy in sites of Wikipedia, and especially with the urgency of critical resistance, who says, you're a research institution, we don't want 120 UC Berkeley students on our doorstep saying, we want to help you. That's kind of a burden for us, actually. But what you do have access is the privilege of research and those skills, and the Wikipedia Foundation has been the bridge to enable those technologies to take place. So I'm seeing the two things, right, which is both synergistic technologies, removing gaps, possible places of equity actually going away, and also the ways in which our classroom, because we are increasingly an undiverse site of education, enabling the community and their diversity to become disruptive diversity for the kinds of research we do, and technology is becoming kind of that space. So I'm kind of confused.
Chris?
So I would just push it a bit or add a dimension to it, which is that it's come up that you have to have the tools to tell the story, and now that we're somewhat increasingly getting the tools, we can tell the story. And the way that we typically think of doing that is with giving people cameras and giving people access to put their footage out. But and this sort of speaks to the big data title in the panel, there's a way in which we increasingly are understanding our world through data about it. And so that's where we should look for the next set of tools to enable people to tell their stories. And I think it's an important one because, what do sources of power do when everyone has a camera? Well, they make their method of oppression invisible to things like cameras. So, you begin to disinclude people not physically with a fence, you disinclude them by defunding the resources that they have or by other things. And those don't necessarily show up with the tools that we're using today, but they can show up in these methods of data analysis. And so I think that's sort of the next frontier of trying to figure out for social justice how we enable people to sort of tackle those challenges.
Okay, I'm in. Thank you.
So actually, this flow is quite interesting because I didn't know how it was going to go down. I was sitting here wondering, should I give an optimistic or pessimistic answer after several academics gave wonderful, statements? And I've decided for this first round I'm going to give a pessimistic answer, but only because I'm an industry scientist and scientifically I'm going to be a bit pessimistic right now. Data. We don't understand it. I mean, everyone loves this whole big data thing. I have more data sitting on more machines that I can't even count. Nobody really kind of gets it. And I liken it akin to numerology. You're just like running numbers through systems. And I'm no disrespect to anyone who does machine learning in the room. I do it myself. But we don't really understand certain key things. We know that data is there. We know everyone clicked on that thing. But we really don't understand things like engagement. We don't understand things like literacy. And taking the standard big data approach, which just says, here's the chunk of data, and let's just churn and churn and churn until we can get something predictive, doesn't tell us anything about people and how the system is being used in a deeper context. We have to do other things to do that. We have to think about what is the communication structure here. We need to do ethnography and qualitative research that validates against it. You mentioned something about consumerism. Tim Berners-Lee said a couple weeks ago in a panel, most of the data, actually, I think he said all the data that's being generated by people is not being collected for the people. It's being collected for the people buying the data, right? And so you think about instrumentation. It was Tim Berners-Lee, it wasn't me who said that. If you think about the instrumentation now, what are we going to instrument? Okay, we're going to instrument for the people buying the data. We're going to instrument for the people monetizing and displaying ads against it. We're not instrumenting to understand engagement at a deeper level. We're not instrumenting to understand literacy. And these are the things we need to actually address, academically and in industry research and across the board.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Let's move to a second question, which I think David D. was getting at. I thought he was saying we have one form and we try to fit people to that form. And the question is, must we hack tools to make them more inclusive?
Well, let me start off with that.
Okay.
I think poor people have always hacked tools. And that's part of the challenge we have. We've always come from a position of creating something out of nothing, or as Shagji said, make a dollar out of 15 cents. And I don't think that's ever been recognized. And I think when I talk about this consumerism, pushing us in a position where we ourselves even forget that the ability to be that resourceful is very much a genius type of situation. Not only is it a genius, but it's actually spawned a lot of industries. You look at, say, the pager once upon a time, which was just used by doctors, almost exclusively, until poor folks got it and started to use that to send messages across. And then by the time you move it and fast forward, we're giving accolades to, somebody sitting in Silicon Valley for being able to help Barack Obama get elected because he sent political messages on his BlackBerry, and they're like, what a great use. But meanwhile, folks in the hood had been using that because they couldn't afford a computer. They didn't have cell phones, and this was a good way for them to do that. But they did that because they had no choice but to hack a situation and create something that would be useful. So I think one of the things that I always tell both my students and anybody I talk to is that technology is not something that's beyond our reach. It's always been within us because that's being technical is what's allowed us to create something out of nothing. Now, with that being said, as we move forward and we do start to get these type of tools, the question of understanding how they operate, can you, once upon a time it was, could you build your own computer? And I know a lot of folks in the hood that could put together something that would, they could build their own computers. But now when you start to use these platforms like a YouTube and, or some of the new blogs or whatever, can you hack into those? Can you flip that in a way that makes sense for your way of telling the story? Or can you actually create something that is just unique to your own and you actually own it? That's where we're starting to have that challenge right now. And I think that gap can easily be filled if we start to encourage a climate that says that technology and the ability to quote-unquote hack is not something for some smart white kids or Asian kids who are sitting up on a university campus. We have to make sure that that language, or at least when we talk to people, to let them know that they are part of that culture. If anything, they might have encouraged some of those folks on those university campuses to do the very things that they're doing. You know, when you think back, for example, of Steve Jobs and them talking about when they started, they were basically, you know, hacking phones, you know, giving everybody free things. Well, you know, in my community, you know, I had free cable for years. I've had free phone service for years, right? Because when they turned the phone off, guess what? Ray would come down there and he knew how to work the box and get that thing, you know. And this is, we laugh at this, but how serious was it for many of us when we had to do it out? When the electricity got off, it was your Uncle Leroy who came down there and knew how to fix those wires. And I think over time, people who are in power have been afraid of that potential and have been very deliberate in making sure that the divide that exists is one that's more based upon mindset. Y'all black people, y'all brown people, y'all not really smart enough to have technological adaptness. So we start to actually believe that and stop thinking in terms of being creative, in terms of being able to create a phenomenon out of thin air. So I think part of what we have to do is go back to reminding folks of their potential and their genius. And the other thing is that we really have to be in those communities and share the information. And I'll just close by saying that some of the people that I know who have been technological wizards, they didn't really learn it in the classroom. They learned it from the people that they were around. You know, somebody comes off the campus at Silicon Valley, sits down and says, look, this is what you do. When I first got on the web, I was on the web before it was called the web. You know, I had a website before we even had websites. And it was only because there were folks that this is what they did. They ate this up and they sat me down and they said, look, we're going to show you how to do A, B, C, and D, and if you have any questions, call me. And again, it comes back to what I was saying, time. I spent an hour, 2 hours, then I call and be like, I don't know how to do this. They show me a shortcut, and then I got good at doing what I needed to do. That sort of mentoring, I don't think is as widespread and as impactful as it needs to be for the numbers of people out there that I think if you let them loose, they would actually flip this technological world upside down in ways that we haven't imagined. And I think that's the threat, because they may actually move the ball further ahead than Steve Jobs or anybody else ever could have imagined. And that's something that I'm looking forward to seeing happen, but there's some that don't want to see that happen.
So I had a good follow-up for that, and this will be the optimistic side of things. I promise optimism. So the people in power, the people that are trying to silence these things that you're mentioning, they don't understand it even more than we don't understand it, right? True. And that's actually very interesting. Now, I'm going to tell a little story as an aside here, but it means, what's the nature of the hack when we say, you know, this hack here on the second question? My family's Egyptian. Last year during the revolution, cell phone was cut off, internet was cut off. Everyone's like, it's the thing. Facebook caused the revolution, Twitter caused the revolution. No, people made the revolution. And there was the communication channels that they used. When those channels were cut and riots were happening in the neighborhoods, what do you do to communicate? And what they ended up doing, like cousins were telling me, they used the minarets. And everyone had it up in the minarets, and then they would hear for different things, and they used the minarets to do widespread communication in localized neighborhoods, right? So there's a communication structure in place. People know how to use it, and they'll use it when they need to use it. They'll use it however they use it. And whether it's a fake profile on a dating site to have some email traffic that no one's going to know about, or using minaret towers, overloading them so that you can send community information around when you're being pulled, it'll happen. So I think what we need to say is, again, back on the literacy point, we need to increase our perception of what the hack is, and that will further empower for social justice.
We're on the same page.
So I just got back from Qatar at the TEDx Summit, and I'm sitting over there listening to this guy talk about, oh, we can like hack things together. Even in Africa, they know how to hack things together. And I'm just looking at him like, wow. I come from Nigeria, a culture where we hack stuff. That's what we do. You know? If my iPhone is broken, it's not broken. Wait till I get home at Christmas. Somebody we'll bring that phone back to life. So this is what we do. We have entire villages, all they do is just hack phones together. They can create phones from all the little scraps. So we have this culture of hacking. What is stopping us over now that we're in the West from doing this is, one, education. Two, there's this fear of technology that I think parents give to their kids. So you buy an iPad, maybe it costs you $500 or $600, and your kid takes the iPad and runs with it. Most parents are going to say, oh, be careful. Don't do this. Don't throw it around. If you find your child cracking that thing open, most parents will go ballistic. That is what is stopping the culture of hacking. Let the kid crack the iPad open. Let him rip it apart. Let him figure out what's going on. If you can't do that, you're making the kid afraid of technology. So he's going to grow up being a consumer of technology. He's not going to understand that I can design technology, I can create whatever I want to create. Encouraging our kids not to be afraid of that, and us being bold enough to say, it doesn't matter, it costs $600. Think of the $600 as a big investment into your kid's imagination. And this may sound sacrilege because I'm also in education. Education is overrated. If somebody's telling, I even detest the word teach, because teach connotes that somebody's going to tell you what you need to know. Something about that is offensive to me. It's a power dynamic. No, I need access to what I want to know. All you need to do is give me access, and I'll take it from there. We should empower our kids to do exactly that. There's so many resources online. Whatever you want to know, all you got to remember is you can Google it. You can figure it out and start playing and start hacking. People are hacking institutions. Let us encourage our kids to have that hacker culture. And it doesn't mean that you're antisocial or you're somewhere in somebody's basement. It just means that you have the critical thinking to create tools that serve your own purpose.
I want to agree with her and I want to disagree with her. I think there's a role for teachers. I think that, the availability of technology and tools in the classroom are things that have to be figured out. I think that adults who have more experience may not be better at operationalizing some of the, I would call more minor technological aspects of the tool. But when we're starting to talk about deep learning, and I think where I'm agreeing with her, is that we do need a shift in our conceptual frame. Now, certainly, the notion of this banking concept of teaching has got to change. And one of the things that technology is allowing us to do is facilitate that change, because if we talk about a more rhizomatic approach, an approach where there are multiple ideas brought into the classroom, and this is what design thinking is about. When she's talking about the idea, she's really talking about how do we leverage multiple ideas that exist in the classroom, bring that to a level of defining what the challenge is, raise that to the level of creating a prototype that models our attempt at a solution, test that prototype so that other people can give us responses back to those ideas so that we reiterate it. But kids aren't going to come in with a process of, this to me is really what project-based learning should also be about. I mean, when we start talking about a reconceptualization, too much of learning is not embodied. So the notion of somebody sitting there, whether they're free on their own or whether it's somebody trying to pour something in a banking concept and orientation into them, is missing the way we actually learn in the real world. We're not sitting and just, playing on our computers all the time. We're embodying the learning in a variety of activities that we're engaged in that are automatically collaborative. We're not just learning as individuals. We're learning from others who are around us, like the brother here was saying. So I'll just give you one anecdote in terms of just the notion of, because I think that the mindset is we're still using a 20th century conceptual framing of education, trying to address 21st century problems. So I'm teaching a class on urban education, and for the first time, I got all 3 of our credential programs in it. That meant that we had 44 students in the class, but we also wanted to have a community partner join us via Skype. So the community partner was going to go through university extensions. And so we ran it all the way through, and then the university extension pulled up my class list and said, wait, you have 44 students, and the room size is 44. But I said, we're Skyping the person in. They're only there virtually, but they would not allow him to take the class because, because it was a goal, it would have made a 45th student. So again, to me, this is like 20th century, thinking in a 21st century context.
Anyone else on that question, or should we move to a third? Okay, we'll move to a third because time is fading. The third question is, how could we measure inclusion? How could we measure inclusion?
Well, I think inclusion comes when people stop trying to measure data as a validation of who they are and who they aren't. It's always funny when people start to be like, well, I got 10 hits and I got 30 clicks and I got all these types of things. And that all of a sudden becomes a measure of who they are. And just having worked in the music industry and also being one of these people that, I worked for some of these big companies programming music for a long time, a couple of big ones, where they had to measure data. Well, I used to laugh because it would be a collusion between the big five that would sit there and say, we will come up with a measuring system. We will put Arbitron's name on it with a license, and then we'll sell that to the rest of the world. And so basically you have five people that's always going to be on top, at least when I was working there, and everybody else having to, figuring out that their worth was going to be based upon what in a sense was an illusion, And so what it does, it moves people away from the actual art and necessity of communicating with people, meaning like, I'm not broadcasting to you, but I'm actually communicating. Like I say something, you say something back, I respond to that, and we start to build together versus moving in. When I say consumerism is like, well, I got this big horn, and I get to talk, and everybody got to listen because I got 3 million views or 3 million hits, and that makes me somehow important, and everything I say, therefore, must be valid and important. And I think we have to move in a direction of not rejecting it just to reject it, but we have to be, one, critical, and two, we have to not be discouraged just because, CNN tells you that the sky is red when you know damn well it's blue. Just because Fox News tells you there's weapons of mass destruction, you know that there ain't. You see what I'm saying? But we measure ourselves against these things. There was an email that went out, and I'll just conclude, and this will underscore what I mean, that was talking about a secret meeting that went on in the music industry a few years ago to move people from conscious Afrocentric rap to gangster rap. And I had been to a couple of meetings, not that particular one, but I've been to meetings in radio where we were talking about making program changes, and I made mention of that. And then you get somebody goes, source please, do you have a link? Well, first of all, I'm an accredited journalist. I've worked for these things. If we want to use that, but how about just validating my own experience, that if I said I sat in the room, why do I need to have it, CNN report on it if I'm telling you what the story is? But we've gotten into a habit of like, well, if it doesn't show up on these platforms that somebody says is the real deal, then everything else is doubtful. Did it come from the university? Did it come from these other types of things that are hierarchical in nature, when really the problem or the challenge that we have is that it should be a circle where all of us are there sitting around the campfire together, sharing and experiencing and building together, versus me sitting up here and saying, it's this direction or no way at all, and everybody having to follow that. I think that's the type of challenge we have, and we have to move past that if we really want to have a holistic way in which we can, one, communicate with each other, and two, ultimately bring about some social justice in some of the issues that we're facing. So the day that this becomes inclusive is when we stop validating ourselves with rule makers who never allowed us to sit at the table and help make the rules.
Well, I'll jump in quickly. Go ahead.
Okay. Go ahead. Well, I would just say that I think in addition to whatever new tools we might come up with, we can't disregard just obvious obvious answers that seem to have lost favor in our sort of current public discourse. And Helen Milner's great presentation, she made the point at one point that, you know, it's not just about money. And it sort of echoed with me how often we say, you know, when we talk about problems in education and access to hackable materials in schools, and we say, oh, money's not the answer. But that is such an easy alibi for the fact that that's good because no money is given to education. And that if we look at like where the money that does exist in education goes, it replicates existing social injustices. So I don't know that we need to, part of advocating for inclusion seems like it's not just about being able to put up a video on YouTube so that it can get lost in the sort of overwhelming number of non-serious, non-political things that are out there and say, well, you know, you can get your voice heard too. Just put it out here. I think we can't disregard, you know, just the traditional meat and potatoes, being politically active and arguing for equal representation in terms of things like government funding, you know, and access to public resources, all these other things that are right now slowly getting rolled back.
But there, did you want?
I was going to say something if we're going to be talking about inclusion and measuring inclusion. And it just suddenly occurred to me, like, this is a very good platform. I'm the president of the Black Graduate Engineering Science students here at UC Berkeley. And the number of black students in graduate school, if we're going to talk about inclusion, in engineering is dwindling down. We have numbers coming in every year where we have, one year was 4 students accepted. 4 students chose to come. The following year was 3 students. The following year was 2 students. The following year was 1 student. To the point now that it's looking like extinction. And it's not even like hyperbole, it's the reality. There are no students, period. And we can't even run beaches anymore because there are just not even enough physical bodies in the College of Engineering to keep this thing going on. If the black graduate students at Berkeley drop off, it may seem like, oh, it's not such a big deal, but it is a big deal because a lot of the black faculty in engineering come from Berkeley. Many of the top schools only hire within themselves, so that's Berkeley, Stanford, and MIT. If Berkeley drops off, then the number of people coming down the pipeline to MIT and Stanford drastically reduces. So over time, 30 years from now, we're going to be talking about, remember when there were black professors in engineering? And this is in the 21st century. So how do we measure inclusion? How about minority representation all along the hierarchy and holding people accountable? If you don't find them, don't just assume that, well, we couldn't get a good one. That's a story. The reason why they're not there is because you don't care. And if you lose diversity, you lose access to a lot of problems. You talk about big data. We work with big data. We're working on a metaphor research project. Metaphors are hard, and it's something that people don't want to talk about. But the reason why they can't hack big data is because there's a big part of it that is missing. It's culture. Yeah. And if you have people who are not from one culture trying to understand another culture, no amount of number crunching is going to get you there. So you actually need people from those cultures crunching the big data. And if those people are not there, big data is not going to save you.
I'll go a step further than that. I'll say that the metrics that we have are just primitive at best, right? We have the click data, right? But click data doesn't really tell us anything, but that's generally all we have. Beyond that, when you look at sort of like social, when you get to sort of human social dynamics, if you look at social network analysis, what we know from those measuring centrality and influence, those metrics don't work at this scale, first of all. They were set up for a small world phenomenon. They weren't set up for millions of people in a network. Second of all, they just sort of normalize everything into one snapshot of a graph. They don't look at gender. They don't look at culture. They don't look at the graph's not even, it's temporally made over 2 years. Just here's the graph, boom, right? So these metrics that we have, but we still use those to compute, closeness, centrality, right? We still use it to understand influence. And we need to start thinking about what are the next set of metrics that will do this. Because it's not just the click data, and we have to expand the social network analysis work. We have to think about engagement, and like one way you can tell engagement, especially with video content, is the lack of activity. Mm-hmm. Because you're watching it, right? But if you look at like click log data, you say, well, the user's not doing anything anymore, they've lost interest, and that's the general thinking that the world does. That's wrong. And so we need a whole new set of metrics to actually do this properly.
I'd like to offer a metric for inclusion. And I would argue that inclusion goes up when poverty goes down. So, I would like for us to think in terms of, the larger issue in the society. And, your presentation put a finger on the fact that internet access does have some bump in people gaining more resources to transform their condition. The other aspect, though, is that I think that we also need to deconstruct what we mean by inclusion. What are we including people into, right? And, I love Obama, and I'm volunteering on the Obama campaign, but I was at one of the trainings, and a woman raised the question, why are you only focusing on the middle class? And their answer was like, well, 95% of the people want to identify with the middle class, but, what the discussion was like, you're completely making blind the issue of quote-unquote working class or poverty as an issue at all. And so even being included, if you have these kinds of, bait and switch, terminologies that eliminate what the real issue is by just saying that we're all aspiring to the middle class, then we have to really question what we're being included in.
Can I just add something to what you were saying? And I think he makes a very good point. America, or Western culture, generally tries to move everybody in the direction of being in silos, individualism. And so what happens is, as long as you start to adopt language that does that, and you start to give access to people who will speak in those terms. So when you start to talk about poor folks, right, or you start to use, marginalized realities and communities, it brings into question the structure in which we actually sit in, and that starts to make everybody have to connect dots. And when you start to connect dots, it becomes a problem. I'll use this as an example of the Trayvon Martin situation. There seems to be a cabal of people who have access to the airwaves to talk about it. And I've been watching them and listening, and they only focus on Trayvon. And some of them I know. So, I hit some of the people up from CNN. Have you not forgot about Katrina, Danziger Bridge, Gretna Bridge? Have you not forgot about Algiers and the vigilante there? Or have you forgotten that there are brown folks, being shot up on the regular, on the border? And it's very deliberate. It's like, yeah, I hear you. But then they get on TV and they're like, well, Trayvon, and I got a hoodie and Skittles, right? And then you start to realize after a while that if they start to connect these dots, it becomes very messy. And it's not an open and closed case. Now you have to address a whole lot of isms and schisms, and you have to bring everybody to account. Where you did see the dots connected, just to flesh this whole thing out, was with the CIA or the Secret Service. Now, if it was just one person who had a hooker, then we would have hadn't talked about it. But it was 11, so it made everybody have to talk about things. And as they talked about these 11, then it went up to 18 and 20. And then it was like, well, the Secret Service, and now we have the military. And before long, you start to see everybody being held accountable. Let's bring Janet Napolitano up here, and maybe she needs to be fired. And who else needs to be fired? And that's what happens when you connect the dots. Everything, the structure gets called into question. And so in technology, the illusion is that it's open for everybody, but the game and the structure of American society has been to make it all individual. And so that's the very thing that we have to fight against and be very aware. Otherwise, we'll be sitting in our silos, blogging away, talking to yourself, literally, with the illusion that everybody can hear you. Because what we forgot to do is we forgot to listen. And that becomes an essential part of communication. So I close by saying technology, at least in many forms, at least on the data side, a lot of times it's about communication. And communication is a two-way street. I listen to you, you listen to me, we build together. If it just becomes something where we broadcast, then we do it at our peril. And I thank you for being here.
I'd like you to join me again in thanking our panelists.